Hello, welcome to a special episode of China Forum, covering the U.S. China Policy Foundation's panel discussion event, Tigers and Flies, Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. Today, you will see 5 experts discussing a hot topic in China studies, Chinese President Xi Jinping's attempts to curb corruption in the Chinese government. Enjoy.
I'm David Lampton. I had China Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS, and I want to thank Dr. Huang and the U.S. China Policy Foundation and Ernestine for not only putting together this event, but doing so much to strengthen U.S.-China relations, and particularly work with Capitol Hill and the staff has been one of the particularly important things that's been done. So I want to acknowledge their support in general of the relationship and their sponsorship of this evening and their thanks for all their service to our country. Also, I wanted to say just up front how important the topic is we have to discuss. I think the fact you're here is a recognition of the fact of its importance, and I think this issue is not going away anytime soon. I think this is a long-term protected issue that we'll be talking about at considerable length for a protracted period. Each of the panelists here is an expert on one or another facets of China's domestic economy, society, politics, and so I'm going to ask each of them to just make very brief opening remarks on that aspect of the corruption problem that they think is most significant. And then in answering your questions, they'll weave in other things as appropriate. To my immediate left is Christopher K. Johnson. He's senior advisor and holds the Freeman Chair in China Studies at CSIS. Chris spent nearly 2 decades serving in the U.S. government, intelligence and foreign affairs communities. He has frequently advised senior White House cabinet, congressional, military, and foreign officials on the Chinese leadership and on Beijing's foreign and security policies. Chris has worked as a senior China analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency and served as an intelligence liaison to 2 secretaries of state and their deputies on the worldwide security issues, including those and in 2011 was awarded the U.S. State Department's Deputy Superior Honor Award for outstanding support to the Secretary and her, so I guess this is Secretary Clinton, for his excellent work. Chris graduated summa cum laude with a bachelor's degrees in history and political science from the University of California, San Diego, and received his MA in security policies from George Washington University. Next to him is Yukon Huang, and he's a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. And prior to joining Carnegie, he was at the World Bank as country director for China. His research focuses on China's economy and financial prospects and its global impact. He was the principal advisor for the joint Chinese government World Bank China 2030 report. Yukon has published widely on development issues affecting China. He is also an A-list commentator for the Financial Times on China, and articles are seen in the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, CNN, New York Times, and Foreign Affairs. He has his PhD in economics from Princeton and his BA from Yale. Let me pose a few questions that I'd like everybody, both in the audience and in the panel, to think about in terms of corruption. One is, we've got a campaign going on. It's been going on for 2 years. How will we know success when we see it? What is a successful anti-corruption campaign in China? What could it look like? A second set of issues is we can all see I think the upside of cleaning up corruption in China, but are there some downsides that we need to think about? For instance, if it's prematurely ended, will this lead to popular frustration and actually make a legitimacy weaker? Is Xi Jinping using the campaign not only to clean up corruption, but in the process get rid of competitive political networks and other bureaucratic or regional bases of power? How is the foreign business community going to both react to it, and to what degree will it be affected by it? And is this part of an environment, short term at least, that's strengthening the business environment or making China less attractive in some sense because it's less predictable and more dangerous to operate in a business sense. Finally, to what degree are we running the risk of having bureaucrats and others sort of keep their head low, not be very innovative, and with the idea of reducing their own personal exposure to a campaign that's still not entirely transparent and its directions unknown? So I think there are lots of questions here. I won't go on, but ask Chris to speak. But we'll, by the end of your initial remarks and your questions, hopefully we'll be down the road to understanding. Chris.
Great. Thank you, Mike, and great to be here. Thank the organizers for putting it together. In 6.5 minutes, I'm going to try to answer a few of those questions. I'll leave aside the issue of what does success look like for now, but I think we'll get into that. I kind of wanted to tackle 3 issues that I think are questions themselves in how to understand what's happening. The first is, what is the corruption campaign about? This is a question that is asked frequently, and I think there's been an unfortunate tendency among analysts to kind of look for a single answer, if you will, when in fact anything like this that is complex in the way that it's complex is about many things. And I think with Xi Jinping, I like to refer to it as his multi-layered cake of motivation for the for the campaign. I think at the elite level, the so-called tiger hunt level, it is very much about power politics. It's been very striking that strangely enough, no one close to Xi Jinping or anyone in that sort of so-called princeling group of individuals has fallen in the course of the campaign so far, and that it has been very focused on former presidents, both Jiang Zemin and even Hu Jintao's network, and other powerful actors inside the system. So certainly I think at that tiger level, there's a very strong component of this power grab, if you will. In the military and the security services, I think it's slightly different, and we can get into that further, maybe in the Q&A as to what it means. And then there's the so-called fly level, or the lower level, and I think there the motivation is very different than at the elite level. There, I think it really is about the ugly face of the regime, if you will, that the common people of China see every day. The rapacious local official, the rapacious local police official who shakes people down for various reasons, the child of a local official who drives through the streets in some brightly colored Italian sports car and mows down a lot of people and and is not punished, these sort of issues. And I think Xi Jinping very much sees this as very deleterious, right, to the party. And I think there's a very strong almost messianic component to Xi Jinping, where he does see himself very much as the savior of the party, and he sees this as integral to saving the party. And then I think he views the process as a natural precursor, in fact a necessary precursor, to being able to do these very ambitious reforms that he laid out at the third plenum, right? And a sense that if you don't, if you will, prepare the ground with this kind of anti-corruption work, those reforms are guaranteed to be successful, and you might end up repeating something like what happened in the Soviet Union and then Russia, with a series of kleptocratic oligarchs taking over state assets, this sort of thing. So I think that's clearly part of what it's about. Second question, when will it end? This is something that gets asked a lot, and is it even fair to call it a campaign anymore? Because campaigns end at some point. There's a lot of debate about this, and I think people again have a tendency to oversimplify perhaps, and to sort of say, when are we going to exit the destructive phase, anti-corruption, and enter the constructive phase of moving toward reform? And I would argue that, at least from Xi Jinping's point of view, those two things are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they go very closely together. You can't do one without the other. And I also think the regime has been actually quite transparent about how long this is going to last. At the sort of traditional cycle, when they came back from Beidaihe in 2013, and they had the standard Politburo meeting, and they announced the dates for the plenum, and everyone thought, wow, third plenum, that's going to be important. They focused on that. They missed the fact that they also announced that they had a 5-year anti-corruption plan running through 2017. So at a minimum, it's going to go at least that long. And I think it will probably go longer. And that means that this will be sustained. And I think the other piece of that is that, surprisingly, shockingly, and this speaks to some of your questions, it still appears to be the case that not everyone's getting it, that this is sustained. Some of these internal speeches that she has supposedly given that have been leaked kind of talk to this issue and sort of say, one of the key targets in the campaign is the memo to all of you who haven't gotten it yet, that this is serious. I like to call these people candidates for Darwin's waiting room, but, they're still there. And this is an ongoing, and she, I think, has to continue to validate the campaign. And then the last question kind of speaks to a couple of your questions, which is it harmful in some way? And I think the clearest evidence here, and I'm actually very keen to hear Yukon's thoughts, is it is harmful to the economy. I think they're discovering, as one senior official told me, they didn't recognize how dependent the economy in certain sectors, especially luxury goods, things like this, were dependent on cadres, which was kind of surprising to me that they didn't know that, but clearly they did not. And I think what we're seeing here in recent months is the group of detractors, critics, whatever you want to call them, the people who are probably being the biggest victims of the anti-corruption campaign. Their narrative early on to kind of push back against the anti-corruption campaign was that it's a mad power grab by Xi Jinping and he's a megalomaniac like Mao and therefore dangerous and will crash the party. I think that got some traction in some elite circles, but not much. I think what we see now with the economy decelerating rapidly, much more rapidly obviously than they initially expected, that group has modified that narrative. And the narrative now is that the aggressive pursuit of the anti-corruption campaign is shaving additional whatever you want to say, point and a half off of GDP, and that ultimately undermines their justification to continued one-party rule. And my sense is, from my last trip there, that this narrative is gaining some traction, and that the detractors like this narrative because it's out of Xi Jinping's control to some degree. The economy is the economy, and it'll do what it'll do. So I do think it's harmful in that regard. It's also harmful in another way in that it has caused, pick your term, I use near paralysis in the system with regard to decision making. As you were pointing out, local officials don't want to put their head up, they don't want to take risks, and they certainly don't want to approve deals, and that has real impacts for the business community. So I'll stop there. And
well, thank you, Chris. Yukon.
Thanks. That was a very good survey, Chris. I'm going to try to complement your presentation by focusing on the economic aspects, which I'm an economist. Indirectly, I think I'm going to be addressing the issues that David posed. Let me basically begin by saying what you read about corruption is very complicated. There are many factors. There's so many solutions. How can you make heads or tails of this subject? So let me start by trying to simplify the discussion. What is corruption? Corruption, by an economist, is the use of public office for personal gain. So it's not two private people. They may be immoral, they may be illegal, but that's not corruption. You have to have the public involved. Let me use this definition to look at corruption and answer three interesting questions. Economists basically argue that corruption retards growth. If that's the case, why has China grown so rapidly? Did it grow because of corruption, or did it grow in spite of corruption? Second, most developed rich countries, corruption comes down. Corruption is supposed to moderate the richer you are and the faster you grow. In China's case, corruption is getting worse the richer they are. So even on these first two questions, China seems to defy the standard ways we look at it. In fact, economist studies, China always comes out as the outlier. It doesn't fit. Third, how do you address the systemic causes of corruption? Here you actually, and most people conclude, you need a degree of political liberalization. What do we mean by that? How do we know when it's going to occur, and when will it occur, and why will it occur? Now I'm going to talk about this from an economist viewpoint, not as a political scientist, so it's going to be slightly different. Let me go back to the person who started this all, Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping came forward with two major propositions: open up and reform. He created the dual economy in China, a market economy and a centrally planned economy side by side. And later I'll explain corruption is inevitable. Second, he basically said, to get rich is glorious. And of course he meant that if you work very hard, this is great, you make a lot of money. He didn't mean that you could make money illegally. But legally, illegally, that was the tenet. So what he did was he launched the dual economy. And what is the dual economy? The dual economy has three players. Player one is a private entrepreneur. Dong basically told him, go out there and make money, produce. And he sees the possibility. He wants to produce something new, better than the old centralized economy. But he has no resources. So he finds where the resources are, and the resources are controlled by player number two. He's usually a manager and an SOE. The SOE controls the land, the money, the capital. The two start to get together and figure out how I should do something. But player A and player B, they can't succeed without player C. And player C is the local official party member, because only he can bless this arrangement. So the three of them can collude. And they collude and bribe and share, and they strike arrangements in a centralized system, highly regulated, but it makes it function. And they get away with it, of course, because Dong basically said we must grow rapidly. So as long as you collude, but grow rapidly, it's fine. And that means investment must surge. So every official has a goalpost, a performance target. Investment must go up. Growth must be high. And if you do this, it's fine. A lot of money is made in this process, because the more money you make, the more money you can share it. So the more rapidly China grows, the more corruption grows in this particular system, because of the way incentives are structured. Now, how do you deal with this? Because it's actually not growth inhibiting. It actually generates more growth. And the answer, of course, the problem is a moral problem. It creates a sense of injustice, unfairness in China. It jeopardizes the legitimacy of the Communist Party. So there you have Xi Jinping coming through. Because corruption campaigns are almost always led by moralists. They target extravagant expenditures, bribery, corruption. They increase the penalties. Now, why do they increase the penalties? More people go to jail, more people get executed. There's been an economic study which showed that of the corrupt people, only 3% go to jail. So it's a low-risk, high-payoff profession. However, if I execute a few people, I've changed the odds. So the moralists are basically going along that line. Now, you have the premier and you have others, those who are dealing with what I call the economic aspects. What do they focus on? The regulations, the bureaucracy. And what are they both groups trying to get at? The biggest source of corruption in China today is the control over inputs of production. That's a very technical economic term. What do I mean by inputs of production? Land, energy, capital, labor. All three of these inputs of production are controlled. Therefore, they're ripe for rent-seeking activities. Land is being expropriated, taken away from farmers, developed and sold, fortune being made. Energy, split markets, differential prices, controlled, fortunes being made. No wonder Xi Jinping has targeted the energy corporations as his first target. Capital, subsidized for state enterprises, local authorities, siphoned off and goes to the private sector. No wonder Chairman of the Central Bank wants to free up interest rates. Labor. Now, why is labor a source of corruption? Because labor can't move in China. And you have restrictions about residency, so hukou policy becomes a big issue. You can buy a hukou in Beijing for 200,000 renminbi. Have you ever thought of the fact that you could buy residency and it has a price? All three of these factors of production are the source of corruption in China, and they're the source of government reform agenda. So the link between reform and corruption is not accidental. They actually basically interrelated, and they have to be solved. Now, how do you deal with the political liberalization, and is it necessary? My favorite example is the example of a Chinese dining chair. Think of the Chinese economy as a dining table, a big round table, and the table is the economy. It's held together by a central pillar. That's a dining table, Chinese dining table. This is an extraordinarily successful growth model, because that pillar is the composition of the party, the government, banks, enterprises, but all fused together. Partly for corruption purposes, partly for coordination purposes, but a really effective growth engine. Now, what does this Chinese dining table have to do? It has to become a Western table. It has to be split up into a square. It has to have 4 legs. The party, the government, enterprises, and firms have to be split up. That's a big political issue, and that requires political liberalization. I've run out of time, but I can give you later, perhaps, an economist's interpretation of how that's going to occur, when it's going to occur, and why it's going to occur. But let me stop here.
Thank you, Yukon. want to encourage you all to ask questions. While you're thinking of one, I think one that might tie together and provide a segue to the audience participation is the question of, I think Bruce, you mentioned punishment and institutions. And of course, many of the people that are being accused, and I think this is what we have to say, accused of corruption, are in fact being processed by a party administrative rule in a non-transparent circumstance. And therefore, I would think the public couldn't be entirely sure that once you begin to pull the thread, they follow it to the logical conclusion. What constitutes evidence and all of that is, of course, unknown. So can this really be effective unless you build an independent judicial system in some respect that's seen by the public to be somewhat independent from the people bringing the accusations? Or does it just compound the cynicism?
Well, this has been one of the issues for the party ever since it gained power in '49, is not allowing any other watchdog over it. It's the nature of the Leninist party to not allow other organizations to have equal power, equal stature to challenge it. Corruption has been a problem identified as such throughout the post-Mao period, and they've consistently refused to allow any other organization to actually be a watchdog. At the local level, the inspection organizations are actually under the jurisdiction of the people they're designed to investigate. So it's obviously not designed to deal effectively with it. The CDIC is not seen as a particularly powerful organization. At least it wasn't until Wang Qishan became head of it. And so now it seems like it does have a little more bite to it. But it's still much more in terms of punishment than it is about preventing it in the first place. And the fact that it's much more, it's not a transparent process. One of the best indicators of this is as a consequence of the anti-corruption campaign, China's ranking in the Transparency International Index has actually fallen because it's seen as being a non-transparent process. It's not moving toward anything like a rule of law. It seems to be very politically motivated, and therefore it's actually fallen as a consequence of the campaign and not improved, at least the international perception of corruption in China.
Mm-hmm. I would just say and wonder about a comment then. You said that the party's never allowed external validation policing, so to speak. Of course, there's one big exception, and that's when Mao mobilized the streets in the Cultural Revolution on the party. And of course, mass mobilization then runs its own... That runs its own risk. So what seems to be happening here is things are taken down like this dome video and so on quite rapidly. There's a fear on the one hand of you want to engage people, but you don't want them too engaged and mobilized. And so I wonder if there's any risk of what you might call from the party's viewpoint excessive mobilization. Anyway, the audience. Yes, sir. Yukon, you go. Please.
Well, on your first question about whether China is seeking out collaboration with foreign governments in addressing corruption, the answer is yes. It's trying to, in some cases, request extradition of people who've been identified as corrupt. There is discussions and legislation about signing reporting requirements for financial banks and institutions so that the accounts of Chinese nationals overseas will be made available and known to the Chinese government, just like Americans overseas have to report their income. Your question about whether or not the corruption campaign is having an impact upon exports and imports, well, let me just say, generally speaking, it is in fact inhibiting or curbing back activity, generally speaking. To the extent that trade-related activities, whether it's in the production sense or the actual shipment sense is affected, it will have a negative impact. Now, one direct way of having impact is that there is a lot of money leaving China. It's accelerated in the last 6 months. I don't think it's actually linked to the corruption campaign. Let me take it back, maybe a portion. It's leaving partly because the sense of the RMB appreciating is no longer there. The dollar is getting very, very strong. So those who put their money in China on the grounds that the RMB is going to appreciate vis-a-vis the dollar are pulling it out. The second reason is that Chinese households and firms are diversifying their holdings overseas. You can now fairly easily transfer your money in Chinese bank accounts overseas if you have proper documentation. You couldn't do this 6 months ago. So it's a lot easier for them to buy property in the West. But that property also is associated with the question of whether it's corruption related. There's much more auditing of property ownership in China. They're establishing a registry of ownership. So if someone owns 30 houses, it's going to become more apparent, and the question of who owns it is going to become more apparent. So lots of people are selling their stuff. So this is affecting money flows, and the trade flows are slightly different, but the trade flows are affected because they've been used to disguise capital movements. And I think you're going to see a lot more errors and omissions of movements disguised as trade, but perhaps related to the movement of capital, partly for good economic reasons, but partly because of the corruption campaign.
I know how, well, here's very simple. I think corruption is the result of monopoly of power, mass corruption. As well, as we all know, Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So if the Communist Party has absolute power, it can't be rid of corruption. That's very simple. And I think the day when the Communist Party start to share power, and that's the time when we can talk about clear of corruption. That's one. And for Mr. Chai's the film, I'm very, very moved. It's just addressed a very, very basic condition of how Chinese people live. And well, it's mind-boggling for the Chinese government to ban it. It's really mind-boggling. And I think only people who wants to, cover their eyes and don't really see what's the reality. I think those people live in Beijing as well, right? Want to cover that truth because that's the truth which is uncoverable.
On the latter, do you have a thought on that? Is raising wages the magic bullet here?
I mean, Singapore is a good example. The civil service salaries are global levels. Singapore also has the highest inequality in the world because people at the lower levels are paid Southeast Asian standards, people at the upper levels are paid New York standards. So I personally do not see that being able to work in a country as diverse as China. But you have a fundamental problem. You have an economy doing extremely well, heads of corporations, state corporations being paid relatively modest salaries, dealing with companies which are global companies. Globalization just makes this contrast difficult. So it is an issue. It doesn't have an easy solution. But this is part of my discussion of the fact that as long as you have a dual economy, a socialist portion with controlled state-ministered guidelines, wages, and a market, you have this tension that cannot be resolved. The only way you can resolve it is what the third plenum said. It basically said that we want to make the market dominant in allocating and pricing resources. The question is whether the government really will. Because if you don't, you're in this transition phase, and economically speaking, there's no way that you can actually eliminate corruption when you're in this no man's land, because you have this contradiction that cannot be bridged.
This concludes part 1 of our 2-episode special. I'm Emily O'Brien. See you next time on China Forum.